The next item is looking at what are the limitations. When we look at the four firm concentration or HHI, what are the limitations before we go interpreting them the wrong way? One is global markets. We could see very different regional market shares as we go into the global markets. We may be concentrated in certain continents and not present whatsoever in others. The other is the markets themselves. There is in the United States regional strengths of certain companies where they're high market share, high brand awareness, and in other parts of the country may have very little. The third is industry definitions and product class. What constitutes the industry? What constitutes the product? So just the mere definition might cause some confusion. The technology as used by the industry also may have bearing on the degree of concentration. What we'll see is that certain industries, by their nature, are labor intensive, others are more capital intensive. Service business, for example, would be labor intensive, and company like manufacturing would have obviously more capital intensiveness. And so here we'll look at what is the available technology. And if it's the same for all participants, there's likely to be very similar cost structure, not big advantages. However, if they're quite different from company to company, then that will become a source of differentiation and therefore lead to possibility of more dominance by one strong player. Next, we'll look at the demand and market condition. If there's low demand, typically we may see few firms because there's not much market to serve. Conversely, if there's high demand, we may see many firms. And if it's not that situation, then we might see a dominant player in a very high growth, high demand market. So that would be a strong indicator of concentration. One measure which shows how much influence one company has on its industry is the Rothschild index. So here we look at the elasticity for the total market divided by the elasticity for one firm. If a move in the firm has impact on the market, that's quite different than if a firm's action has very little or no impact on the market itself. So in other words, if it equals 1, that means the industry and the firm have the same elasticity and there's no substitutes. So one firm has a lot of influence on the industry as a whole. If it's low, that means that whatever moves happen at the firm level has less action into the elasticity for the market as a whole. So low means less control, less power, and high means more concentration and more power. When we look at an example here, we'll have elasticity for airline of -3, and elasticity for an individual character is 4. And what is the Rothschild index? So -3 divided by -4 equals 0.75, which is fairly highly concentrated. So therefore, there are few substitutes because an airline could have some significant influence on the overall market for airline travel. Again, when we look at this measure across different industries, what do we see? We see that in the area of food, the Rothschild index is quite low, 0.26. We see tobacco is dominated by major players, so it's 1.0, as is chemicals, where we're dominated with major companies that control much of the market. So the Rothschild index varies quite dramatically when we look at different industries based on the concentration and power that companies have within those industries. Next, we'll look at the market structure. Is it easy to enter or difficult to enter? What makes it hard or easy to enter? Well, one of the items we look at is what are the barriers to entry? Those might be capital requirements, where if you want to start going into the steel business, you're looking at a major investment, or patents. We may have certain technologies that are controlled for at least the next 10 to 20 years by companies. So to enter that business, you would be at a severe disadvantage absent the control of the technology covered by the patent. And third, economies of scale, where a company is just so dominant in terms of their market share and production that it would be very difficult to supplant them. What is the conduct of the market? First, what is the markup over the cost? Is it high margin business or low margin business? Second, it would be integrations and merger. Is this an industry that's fragmented, or is it one that's starting to consolidate into fewer and fewer players? And advertising, is this an area that has a lot of advertising competition or not? And finally, R&D. Similarly, is it hotly contested, where companies spend high percents of their sales in R&D efforts? On the area of pricing behavior, the Lerner index is handy. Here we take the percentage of the difference between price and marginal cost as a fraction of the product price. In other words, is the contribution margin percent. So if we take price minus marginal cost, that is the contribution to fixed costs and profit divided by the price itself. And here we see that the other relationship is we get restated in terms of price. So the factor of 1 divided by 1 minus the Lerner index equals the markup. Let's try this out as well. So the firm in the airline industry has a marginal cost of 200 and they charge a price of 300. What are the Lerner index and the markup factor? Lerner index is take the price minus the marginal cost, which is 300 minus 200, divided by the price of 300 equals 1/3 or 0.333. In other words, 33% of the revenue goes towards covering fixed overhead and profits. The markup factor is 1.5. Again, for a point of reference, let's look at other industries. We look at tobacco again. Lerner index is quite high. There's a very high markup in that industry, and the markup factor is 4.17, quite high and certainly much higher than airline business. And we see on the other end of the extreme, food, where the Lerner index is 0.26. In other words, the flip side, or 74% of the price goes directly to marginal cost. So we have fairly small margins, contribution margins for food compared to tobacco, and as we saw earlier, compared to airlines.